React. Last week, of course, we did some JavaScript and we went into how you can use Flexbox to assign sort of the location of elements within your site. So once again, you're going to need Git for this very beginning part at the very least. While you're doing that, you should probably install Node.js as well. And so today, we'll cover some Git, React. Next week will be completely React, and we'll just continue to build our club website from week 5 onward. So Git is sort of a version control software. It lets you sort of keep track of the changes that you're making for your project as you do it. If you're going at a project alone, this will let you sort of store incremental versions of your project so that you don't ever lose any progress. If you're going to complete a project with a group of people, then this is a great way to allow multiple collaborators. It will let you work together to build the same project instead of having to pass files around manually and do all that kind of stuff. If you've tried to create a project before in any programming language for really anything, you've probably been met with the challenge of copying and pasting your entire project path or even just individual files as you make changes to them. And Git is essentially a solution to that problem. And so the first thing that you're going to need to do is, of course, install it. And once you've done that, you should be able to open some sort of terminal. In Windows, you can use PowerShell. In Mac, you can use, I think it's just called Terminal. On Linux, you'll have some sort of terminal emulator. And you should be able to type just the word Git into your terminal, and you should get a bunch of stuff to print out. This is just the documentation for what Git actually does, but at least we know now that Git is actually installed on our device. From here, you're probably never going to want to use Git just on its own without some sort of remote repository. And that's just a second place where your Git repository will also be stored that lets other people actually view it and contribute to it. And so today, we're going to use GitHub. There's quite a few others. There's GitLab. There's ones that you can even host yourself if you're worried about security and all that jazz. But for today, we're going to use GitHub because, I mean, it's the leading one. It's the most used. And at some point, you're probably going to want to host your own site on something like GitHub. And so the first thing that you can do is you can, of course, go to GitHub, set up an account, do all that jazz. I've already done that. And so to get started today, the first thing that I'm going to do is actually create a repository right on GitHub. And so when you log in the top right corner, you'll get this plus button, and you can create a new repository from there. I'm just going to call it QWEB test. Of course, you can add a description, and you can decide whether your repository should be public or private. For today, I'm just going to ask you that you leave it public because it will make your life a little bit easier, but you can make it private if you so choose. And if you make it private, it just means that you have to use your login details to be able to actually get at the code on it. So we can do that. I've called this one QWEB test. We can actually click Create Repository, and now we have sort of this remote repository in order for us to store our project. And so it's hosted on GitHub right now, and our next step is to actually get this project locally. And so the way that we would do that is we'd sort of make this connection between our remote repository and our local one. If you've never used Git before, though, the first thing that you're going to need to do is set up what your sort of credentials are. And so this may seem a bit weird, and you're not quite sure why we're doing this, but for now, just know that you have to actually tell sort of Git and the terminal who you are. And so we can use git config in order to set up a name and an email address. And so you'll say git config. You'll use 2 slashes to make it global, and this just means that it works across Git on your entire machine. And then you would say user.name, and you would set in your username here. And so you'd probably want to use your Git username. And so I'm not actually going to do this because mine is already set, but then you'll also do a similar thing using git config global, and you'd set a user.mail and type in an email here. If you're having problems with the introductory stuff with Git and GitHub, then you probably haven't done this. And you put your hand up, a TA will help you set this up. It should only take setting it up once, and then you should be good to go going forward. Does anyone have any questions? All right. So the next thing that you're going to want to do is grab your brand new GitHub repository, and we're going to grab the link that we were given right here, and we're just going to copy it. And so the next thing that we're going to do is actually clone this remote repository onto our local machine, and that just means to make a copy of it. So we can type git clone, and then we can actually copy in the link that we were provided on GitHub, and we'll press enter, and it will say, hey, we're cloning into this folder called QWEB test, and it's going to warn us that we cloned something that's empty because there's nothing there yet. The first thing that you're going to probably want to do when you create sort of a new, when you clone a new repository is you're probably going to want to check the status real quick. And so we can run git status, and this will give us a few bits of information once we actually go into the folder. So I tried to run git status on just the main folder that I was in. So first I have to cd into my QWEB test folder, which was the name of my repository, and now I'm actually within the folder, right? If I use ls to list it all out, you'll see that there's nothing in there. But now if I do git status, Git will tell us just a little bit of information about our repository. And so far it's going to tell us that we're on branch main, which doesn't really mean much to us yet. It's going to say no commits yet, and it's going to say nothing to commit. And all that means is that we haven't done anything yet. And this is a pretty boring command right now, but it'll become much more useful later on. And so the first thing that we're going to want to do is actually add something to our project probably, right? And so one of the ways that we can do that is actually to go into this folder and actually make something. And so by design, usually you want to include a README file with your project just to explain what it actually is. So if we go into our QWEB test folder and we create a new file, and we'll call this readme.md, and we'll just say hello within this file and save it. We actually have a full file within our repository, and so now if we go back to our terminal and if we type git status, you'll notice that it will tell you that you have an untracked file. You've added a new file, but you haven't told Git if you want it to store information about that file. And so the next command that we're probably going to want to get to is how to actually add this file so that Git will track it. And the way we do that is by using git add. So we'll say, hey, git add, and it's going to ask us what we want to add, and of course that's going to be readme.md, and if we press enter and rerun git status, we'll notice, hey, the file name has turned green, and that's in order for the terminal to tell us, hey, we're actually going to be tracking this file's changes. The next thing that we're going to want to do is actually store these somewhere, right? If we head back to our GitHub repository and refresh the page, we'll notice that nothing's changed, even though we've created a README file on our local machine. And somehow we're going to want to create a link between those two. And so what we're going to want to do is first commit our changes. We're going to want to say, hey, these are good changes, we've done some good stuff to our code, and we actually want to store that information. And the way that we do that is by using git commit. And so we'll say git commit, we'll use -m because we're going to type our message right into the terminal. If you just type git commit, it will open up a text editor and you can type a little message in there and save it. But we're going to use git commit -m, and then we're going to type a little message, and we're just going to say readme created. And we're going to put it in quotation marks just so that we don't have to deal with the spaces and all that stuff. So if we type in git commit and we use -m, we put in a message. If we press enter, we've now created that commit, and it will say, hey, look, here's the files that were changed and all that jazz. If we then do git status, it'll say, hey, we don't have any new changes because we've already committed them. And you can think of commit as sort of this soft version of like actually releasing a version of something, right? You can think to video games, they'll release incremental versions, right? Version 1.0, version 1.1, and you can think of a git commit as sort of storing a version of your project that you might want to use later. Now that we've committed it, once again, our remote repository on GitHub doesn't actually have any of these changes on it. And the way that we do that is we actually push it up to GitHub. And so we can actually type the command git push, and we can actually push these changes onto our remote repository in order to allow another developer to see them and maybe contribute to them. And so if I then refresh the page, we'll see that our changes actually show up on GitHub. From there, you can continue to, add new files, you can push if you so chose, and then you can even, maybe someone else made a change on your GitHub repository, right? So if I actually go on to GitHub and if I maybe use this add file shortcut, maybe I'll make a new file and I'll just call it temp.py, make an example Python file, and I'll just say print hello, right? And then if I create the commit and if I say create temp.py, long story short, we can pretend that another developer went into your project, made some changes, and pushed their changes up. And we can see on our remote repository, we have this new temp.py file, right? Someone else's work was done here. And if we head back over to VS Code or even just check our folder, we'll notice that those changes aren't there. And we need some way in order to take another developer's changes and put them on our local machine so that we can work on them further. And first, if we do git status, it'll tell us, hey, we're on branch main, all of our stuff seems fine. But if we then run git pull, it'll pull all this information off of our remote repository, and you'll see right in the terminal, it'll say, hey, look, we added a new file called temp.py, and this file has one line in it. So from there, you can use these commands, git push and git pull, in order to sort of work with another developer on the same project. And so that brings us to the next thing that we're going to want to probably do with Git is we want a way for multiple developers to be able to work together independently without affecting each other. And so that brings us to the first weird thing in Git, which is called a branch. And you can think of a branch as kind of like a tree. What you're going to do is you're going to take someone's work at a snapshot in time. So for example, we would maybe take our work right now, and we're going to maybe branch off of it. We're going to take a copy of it, and we're going to do some work to it, and eventually combine our work together with sort of the original tree, if that makes any sense. And so the way that we're going to usually want to do this is if you're going to add a new feature to your site, you're probably going to want to branch off of it, just in case someone else is also editing the same files that you are. And so the way that you can actually create a branch is by using this checkout command. So we can run git checkout, and we're going to use this -b addition, which will just say, hey, if this branch doesn't already exist, we want to create it. And so we're going to call this branch maybe create-css, right? We're going to maybe create some CSS for our fake website here. And so we've created a new branch. It's called create-css. And if you notice right here, our terminal has told us, hey, we've switched to this new branch. The best way for you to tell what branch you're actually on is to once again run git status. And if we see the output here, it will say, hey, I'm on the branch create-css. Before, it said that we were on the branch main, right? So now we're on this new branch. From here, we could maybe continue to actually edit our site, right? Maybe we'll actually add an HTML file, maybe call it temp.html, and maybe I'll just add some starter HTML by using this shortcut in VS Code, which is HTML:5. If I press enter on that, it just adds some boilerplate HTML, right? We've gone into this before, that I'm just adding some fake stuff so that we have actually something to work with. From here, we could also maybe add in a CSS file, right? We could call it temp.css, and we could do all of the stuff that we've been doing in the previous lessons. From here, knowing what we just learned about Git, we need some way to actually commit our changes, right? We want to store them in some way. If we run git status, it's going to tell us, hey, we're not tracking these files. And so we can, of course, use git add followed by the file names in order to add them. If you wanted to add all of the files within a folder, you could use git add star, but for now, I'm just going to type the actual file names, right? So I'll add temp.css, and I'll add temp.html. Now if I run git status, they've both been added, and once again, Git's all happy with me because I've staged my changes, quote unquote, right? I've told Git to track these files. Now once again, I can do a commit, and I can say, hey, git commit, I'll write in a message, and I'll say added HTML and CSS, right? From there, I've created a commit. Once again, if we go back to our GitHub page, right, our remote repository, we'll see that none of these changes are there yet. And that's because we haven't pushed it in any way, right? We have to push this back up. And so if we then run git push, we'll get this error in our terminal that says, hey, you haven't linked what this is actually called on your GitHub repository. And for now, just know that whenever you create a new branch and if you decide to push it, Git's generally going to give you this command right here, changed for whatever your branch is called, and you're probably just going to want to copy and paste that and run it. All this does is it makes a link between what's happening on your local branch and creating a remote one if there isn't one already. So if I run that, and then I check my GitHub page right away, it says, hey, we have this new branch, and it had some pushes, and if we refresh the page, and if we click on this little branch icon on the left, we'll see our new branch called create-css. If we actually click on it, we'll be able to see our new things that we added, right? That temp.html and that temp.css file. And the real power of Git starts here, because if we head back to our main branch by clicking this branch button and selecting main, you'll notice that none of those changes actually affected our original branch. They didn't change the original version of our website. Eventually, once you're done with your feature, let's say my website is done, we're going to want to somehow combine these two, right? We want our original version of the site to have our maybe new CSS styling or something similar. And the way that we do that is we actually merge them together. And the first way that you could do that is you could do that right on GitHub, right? At the very top of your page, whenever you create these new commits to a different branch, it will say, hey, it had recent pushes, and it will even give you this green button that lets you compare the changes. And so if we click on this, we'll open up into a new screen and create what's called a pull request. And this is just a request to merge these two things together. Eventually, maybe you'll have someone review your pull request or have other developers look at it to make sure that it's in line with what they want, to make sure that it works, have another set of eyes on your code. But because it's only us, we can just say, hey, we can give our pull request a title. And most importantly, if we head to the bottom, it will show us the changes between the two branches, right? So if we were to make this pull request into our main branch, this is everything that we'd be adding, right? We'd be adding a temp.css file, and we'd be adding a temp.html file. From there, we can say, hey, let's create a pull request, and GitHub will check to make sure that you're allowed to actually merge these two things together, and then we can actually click Merge Pull Request and confirm merge, and this is going to take our changes that were in our branch called create CSS and put them onto our main branch. And you'll see that it will prompt you to delete your branch because it will assume that your work is done. For now, we're just going to leave it and not worry about it. But most importantly, if we go back to our QWEB test, and if we go back to our main branch, you'll see that our changes, our new additions of a temp.html and a temp.css file actually show up. And it turns out that it creates this little commit that says, hey, we're doing a merge, but that's okay. For now, all of our changes in our create CSS branch have now been put into our main branch. Yes? Sky, could you help, bud? Okay, thanks. Okay, going forward from here, we've created a different branch, and we've made some changes on it. And it turns out that when you're editing code with a bunch of different people, it's not always going to be this smooth. Sometimes both of you are going to maybe edit the same file. Or maybe both of you are one of you is going to delete a file and another will edit that file. And so that gets us to sort of one of the most unfortunate things about Git is that sometimes when you try to merge things together, there'll be a conflict. There'll be something that has been changed in both versions, and Git won't know what to actually do with that. And so the best way to simulate that is to first check with git status what branch we're on, and we're on the create CSS branch. So if I head into maybe my HTML file, I can create a little change in here. And so I'm just going to change the title of the document to maybe Happy Holidays or something, right? If I then save that file, once again, if I run git status, none of these changes have actually been committed, right? So I need to add the file. So if I add temp.html, if I then commit it and I say maybe minor change, now if I run git status, of course we're all committed and we're all good. So that would be the equivalent of me. Maybe I'm the developer working on the new feature on the create CSS branch. I've done a change where I've changed the title. Now what we can do is we can actually switch back to our main branch. And if you've forgotten the names of all of your branches, you can run git branch in your terminal, and it will tell you what branches you have, and it will even select the one that you're on. Once again, we can run git checkout, and we can check out our main branch. And if we notice in VS Code, it will actually revert back. If we sort of reopen the file, it will revert back to the original version of that branch. And unfortunately, we've run into a little problem here in which we thought that we added our HTML and CSS file onto this branch, and we did, but we did it on GitHub. And we forgot to pull those changes to our local version of that repository. And so once again, we're going to need to run git pull. And once we do that, hey, we'll see that our HTML and CSS files show up. Now that we've done that, we can head into that HTML file, and I can change the title once again. Maybe I want the title to be Welcome to QWEB. Now I can save that. Once again, if I run git status, it'll see that it's an untracked file. Once again, I can add that file, and once again, I can commit using a message. Both of these things have been completed, and I want to actually push this up to maybe GitHub in this case. And so I'm going to run a git push to get both of these changes up onto GitHub. And so if we quickly look at GitHub, and if we refresh the page, we'll see that, hey, temp.html, this one has a title of Welcome to QWEB. And if we head back over to our repository, change our branch over to create CSS, and then if we look at temp.html, we'll see that it has a different title. It looks like I didn't actually push my changes on this other branch, right? So if I check what branch I'm on, if I then check out my create CSS branch one more time, and then use git push, we'll see that it will show up on GitHub once again. So that's all working, right? We were able to switch between our two branches, make changes on them, and now we know that we have two different titles on our two branches. The next thing that's going to happen naturally is we're probably going to want to merge these branches together, right? So we'll head over to our create CSS branch and, we'll head over to our main branch, and maybe we want to actually create one of those pull requests, right? So we'll go to the pull request tab, we'll say, hey, I want to create a pull request, and I want to create it based off of the create CSS branch, right? So if I select create CSS, GitHub is now going to tell us, hey, you have a problem, you can't merge these two together, and the reason for that is we have two different versions of this title being changed. So from there, we can go back into our terminal, right? We'll check with git status, we're on our create CSS branch, and we're going to have to manually merge these together. So the first thing that we have to do is we're on our create CSS branch. We want to merge this with the main branch, right? The original version of the site. So we'll say, hey, git merge. It already knows that I'm on the create CSS branch, so I can now type git merge main, and I'm going to merge my changes with the main branch. It's going to say, hey, you have a merge conflict, you have a problem, and it will actually insert some helpful stuff right into the file if we check. And it will say, hey, look, here's the two changes of this line, right? One of them has it saying happy holidays. One of them has it saying welcome to QWEB. You need to pick one of these changes before we can move forward, right? In VS Code, it will even have these helpful buttons that will allow you to pick between them and automatically delete some of this extra stuff. But you can do this right in a text editor, right? You can grab the version that you want, delete the excess. So maybe if I accept the incoming change, which is this bottom one in blue, if I select that button, you'll see, hey, we've selected this as our response. We've resolved the merge conflict, for lack of a better word. We're still not quite done. We need to save the file, of course. And if we check in this little Git button here, it'll say, hey, it wants us to create a commit about our merge. We can do this in our terminal too if we so chose. So if we run git status, we'll see, hey, temp.html is not being tracked. If we use git add temp.html, it's now being tracked. And now I can say git commit, and I can do a message, and I can say merge. Once I do that, I can run git status once again, and it seems like we're all good. I can run git push to push this back up to GitHub, and you'll see once we go back to GitHub, refresh the page, that our temp.html file has now chosen the same option that I picked. And so we've resolved the merge conflict. We've picked the version that we want to use going forward on our main branch, on our final version of our site, and we're all good. That was probably the trickiest thing about Git that you'll run into while you're trying to use it. Generally, if you're just working on your own, using git add, using git push, git pull, and git clone are going to be the main things that and git commit, of course, are going to be the main things that you're going to use just to store different versions of your project as you continue to work on it. Git can be really tricky. I'm sure a good few of us have lost hours of work to using it improperly, but you can use some sites online like Git Explorer if you want to learn more about it. There's a bunch of graphical ways that you can visualize what's actually happening with Git. But for now, know that this is a great way for us to version sort of what we're working on and version our site. Yeah?
Is there like a VS Code plugin that lets you do Git directly in it?
There is. Exactly. So I did all of this with the terminal just because you'll always be able to do that. But if you actually select the source control button right in VS Code, this will allow you to use maybe a plus button to track a file. It will allow you to actually type a commit message in here. So if I maybe change my file, add a div here and save it, in this version control, it will say, hey, here's the list of files that have been changed. If I press the plus button, I can stage those changes. And that's the exact same thing as doing git add. I can then say, hey, write a commit message in here, maybe saying hello, and press the commit button. And we've done basically everything that we did in the terminal within the user interface of VS Code. And so, yes, it does. Yes?
Just to add on top of that, there's this extension called GitLens, and I'd recommend it because it lets you see a graph view of your branches. So we were talking earlier about how they split off. It actually gives you a visual presentation of that if you install the extension. What's it called? GitLens.
GitLens. So yeah, there's also like a few other online sources that you can use to visualize your entire sort of tree structure. But for now, we're hoping that it'll be pretty simple and you won't really have to use that. But GitLens is definitely a great extension to pick up if you're using VS Code. So from here, we're going to transition a little bit into React. So at the beginning, I had you install what was called Node.js. If you haven't installed that and you want to follow along, once again, get that installed now. And we're going to have you all create your first actual React application. And so we'll leave a few minutes once we've actually done this process to make sure that it works for all of you on your machines. The TAs can help you. But for now, the first thing that we can do is we can open up something like Windows PowerShell, open up command prompt or something similar. And if we head into a directory that we want to do this in, we can use the cd command to do that. Or if you're in Windows, the easiest way is to actually go in File Explorer to where you're looking for. And if you hold Shift and right-click, you'll get this Open PowerShell window option here. And you can open PowerShell directly in that file. So that's kind of what I've done. So now we can actually create our first React project. And the way that we do that, once we've actually downloaded Node.js, is we can use npx, and we can say, hey, we want to create a React app. So we can say create-react-app, and we want to name our React app. And so for now, I'm just going to name it something like new React app, just for the purposes of demonstration. And once we hit enter, this is going to spend a few minutes actually creating a React application for us. And so I urge all of you to actually run this command in your terminal. Create your very own React application using npx space create-react-app, and then you want to give it a name after that. And so for me, I've just used new React app. And so I urge you all to try that out. If it doesn't work, put your hand up. I'll come and help you. But we're going to maybe pause for about 3 minutes or so to have you all create your own React app. It'll take a few minutes to install everything that it needs. But once that's done, we'll be able to move on, and hopefully you'll be able to follow along. Hopefully, all of you have a React app now. At the end of your sort of message, it should say happy hacking, which means, hey, all of this worked. The next thing that you're going to want to do is actually go into that project directory, right? And in this case, I called my React app new React app. And you may have called it something else, but you'll have to type cd and followed by the name of your React app in order to actually get into that folder. Cd means change directory, if you want to look that up later. But essentially, we'll type cd and then the name of our React app. In my case, it will be new-react-app. And if I press enter, I'm now actually in my React app. Right? And if you actually read some of the sort of terminal output that was provided when you created your React app, at the very top it says, hey, you can run npm start in order to start a development server for your React application. And this is how we're actually going to see our changes as we make them. So if we run npm start and everything goes according to plan, we're going to get a little bit of console output. And in a second here, it will say, hey, we're going to start the development server. And in our web browser, it will actually open our templated version of a React application. You'll know it's working if you have a spinning logo at the front. So once again, you can run npm space start in order to run a development version of your React application in order to actually start editing it, right? And so we'll see on our page here that we have this React logo. Everything seems to be working. From here, we're going to actually start to maybe edit some of these files that we've been provided, right? So if we head over to our code editor, if we head over to VS Code, and if we actually look in our new folder, our React application, we have a few folders within here. The first one, is node modules. We're just going to ignore that for now. You can think of that as storing all of the libraries and code that other people have written in order to make this React app work. This is kind of like if you import something in Python, it turns out that a React application actually stores these files directly in this folder instead of somewhere else on your computer. Generally, you're never going to need to open this, so we're just going to ignore it for now. Then you have the source folder, which is going to hold all of your code for your React application. And you can see that the base sort of template actually has quite a few files in it in order to show this logo and create this spinning animation and all of that stuff. We also have this public folder in which we're going to hold stuff like images and maybe some text if we want that text to never change and stuff like that. So for now, the public folder will hold all of our like non-code things that are on our website. Images, text, that sort of thing. And our source folder will hold all of our website's actual code. From here, the first thing that we're going to say is, and sort of abstract away a little bit, is that whenever you run your React application, the first thing it does is actually opens up and runs this index.js file. And this is going to look a little cryptic right when we're starting, but for now, know that, hey, look, this is JavaScript, which we briefly looked at last time. And there are a few things in here that seem a little bit weird, and so we're going to remove them and maybe add them back later once we actually know what's going on. The first thing that we're going to remove is this Web Vitals thing. That's just some pre-constructed code that does some stuff for us, but we're going to remove that. And then we're also going to remove the import statement for that Web Vitals thing up here, right? So then yours will hopefully look exactly like mine. We're also going to remove this React strict mode and just leave the app inside of this root render thing. And if we save the page, you'll notice that actually nothing changes, and that's good. The next thing that we can do is delete some of these extra files. And this is all just like housekeeping stuff just to make our application a little bit simpler and easier to read. So we're going to get rid of the setup tests, the report web vitals. We'll get rid of the app test file. We'll leave the logo for now because why not? So if we delete these files, we now have a bit of a simpler version of our application. And so the first thing that we're going to realize is that most of the content for our site by default is actually stored within this app.js file. And hopefully once we open up app.js, once again in our source folder, stuff will start to make a little bit more sense. Right? Maybe this is starting to look a little bit more familiar. Right? You'll notice that we have some imports at the top. We're going to ignore that. But look, we're defining a function and we're calling it app. And in this case, we're actually returning some HTML code. And it turns out, if we actually look at our website, this starts to look pretty familiar, right? We have our text that says edit source app.js and save to reload. And even further down, we have this link, which maybe links to something. And you'll see that the text is Learn React. And it turns out that the main page of our website is defined right inside of this function, inside of the file app.js. And so we could, in our case, maybe remove some of this HTML and actually write our own. So if we remove all of this, and if we save the file, we'll notice that our website yells at us because we don't have any HTML being returned. And so let's just add something so that it's no longer angry at us and save the file. You'll notice that our website is suddenly blank, and that's because we removed all of the HTML that was already there. And it turns out that we're actually technically not writing HTML, we're writing what's called JSX, which is this weird combination of HTML and JavaScript. And so this will allow us to simply return the HTML tags themselves instead of having to do this weird stuff with React in order to generate them. And so for now, we can actually start to create a website right within the return function of this file. And so maybe we'll create a few more divs, and maybe we'll make a heading, right? And we'll say People Watching Club, which is the fake club that we've been creating for these past few weeks. And if we save the file, you'll notice right away that our website refreshes and updates with our changes. And that's one of the bigger benefits of React, is that as we're actually typing along here, we can see our website side by side actually create those changes instead of having to refresh the page and go between different files. We can, of course, continue to build out a website if we so choose. We could create maybe paragraphs, and we could create tables and all of that stuff. But for now, we're going to sort of say, hey, look, we have a version of this website that you can look at in our released code called Club 1. And so if I pull that up, I can show it to you here real quick. If I turn off this version, right, and then if I go into my Club 1, and if I start up that development server, it'll take a second, but you'll see that we've written out sort of a very basic version of our site in order to be used later. So you'll see here, we have some text here. We're actually adding some bolding within it. And you may wonder, how did we actually get the CSS styling to show up on this page? And it turns out that if we head into our Club 1 directory, right, if we head into source, and once again, if we remember that app.js is the file that defines most of our sort of main website, you'll notice that at the very top, we have this import app.css statement. And it turns out within JSX, or more so within React, we can actually just import a CSS file instead of actually having to manually link it to our HTML like we had to in previous sessions using that style sheet link. And so if we look in our sort of source directory, we have something defined called app.css right here, in which all of that CSS is already defined. One other minor change from HTML, if we head back over to app.js, you'll notice here that we're using class name instead of just the word class. And it turns out, unfortunately, that some of the things with JSX are named slightly differently than they're named with HTML. And unfortunately, you'll have to look up the documentation to find those. But for now, know that class name is the exact same thing as class like we used previously. So we're importing our CSS. It's linking them together for us automatically and applying the styling onto our site. From here, we have a few more versions of this site, and the first one is actually within Club 2. And in this one, we've defined a few sort of images, and so if I actually get it running for you, you'll be able to see that. Once again, using npm start, we're able to start our React website up, and it will open in your web browser so that you can see it as you create your changes. So if we open up this version of our site, you'll notice that we have even more styling, we have some bolding, we have a button here, and we have some images with locations and coordinates to those locations. Right? One of the first things, if we actually have a peek at our code, all of this looks pretty normal until we get to our button, in which we have a class name called button, and that's cool because we remember that that is just a class from HTML, but below it we have this onClick thing. And it turns out within React we can define what a button does when you click it using this onClick attribute. And so if we open up in these curly braces, we're actually defining a function. And it turns out within our return statement, within our quote-unquote JSX, if we use curly braces, we're able to type in some actual JavaScript. And if you remember back to week 3, we said that, hey, using these arrow functions, which are parentheses, sort of an equal sign and a right, sort of a right angle sign, and then using these curly braces, we can actually define a function. And so we've defined a function here, and if you check within these curly braces, all that this function does is log out some information to the console. It says, here's some more info, and it gives you a link. So if I actually click on this button, it looks like nothing happens. But if I click the inspect page, and then if I head over to console, you'll see that every time I click it, we're actually printing something out to the console. And so this is another way in which eventually we can create a very interactive and dynamic website. From here, we've got a few more things, right? We're just using our base normal images and divs and all of that stuff. And this brings us to sort of one of the first powerful things, and the main thing that we want to cover in React today, which is actually called a component. And so a component will allow us to sort of make a block on our website that we want to reuse multiple times. The sort of keen item on you will notice that all of our sort of buildings here follow the exact same format. They all have the same styling, they all have a title, they all have an image, they all have a set of coordinates. And if we actually look at our HTML code, we'll start to see that same pattern of 2 divs, an image, a heading, and a paragraph for each one. And so maybe we want to add another building. And so of course your first thought would be, let's copy and paste this, change out the image, change out the text, and do all that stuff. But maybe one day someone else wants to reuse your sort of component here in order to display an image in a location. And so they'll have to go into your code file, copy and paste it into theirs, and then use it. And it turns out there's a much easier way to do that using React components. And to show you those, we're first going to actually make a new file within our club directory, and we're going to call it components. This is just sort of by design, we store all of our components in one place to make them easier to be reused later. If we head into this components directory, and then if we create a file maybe called infocard.js, we can start to maybe define what this info card will actually look like. From before, we know that we generally want to create a function. In this case, I'm going to call it info card. And we're going to actually take in sort of a variable called props. And this may seem a bit confusing at first, but just know that props are a way for us to pass information into our components. It will allow us to say, hey, every component can have slightly different text, and we can use props in order to define that. So for now, we're just going to say that we can pass along some information within this props variable to our function. And so we'll then open up our function here, and just like our app.js file, we're right away going to start to return something. So we're going to return, we're going to open up some parentheses, and then we're going to return a version of this info card. And so let's actually, for now, let's just grab one of our info cards, maybe the Eiffel Tower one. Let's copy and paste it into our info card and save it. The last difference you'll notice from this file and sort of our app.js file is at the bottom we're saying export default app. And all that this means is it allows for this app, which is in a way a component, but let's just say for now this app page to be used somewhere else within our program. And we want that to be true for our info card as well, because we are going to want to use it within our app in order to create these info cards. And so at the bottom of our info cards file, we're going to say export default info card, which is the name of the function. Once we save that, we now are going to look at how we actually use this info card within our app file. And so if we head back over to app.js, the first thing that we're going to think that we need to do is create some sort of import statement, just like how we would import a library sort of in a previous or other programming language like Python, right? We'd have to import the library. We need to import our info card that we just created. Notice how all of these import statements maybe start with a dot or to show like the current directory and all of that stuff. And so notice how we are inside of the source directory, which then has the app.js file. So if we start to type import, VS Code will do its best to help us out. But if we type dot, then we can actually go up one directory. So maybe we use dot dot to go up one directory. And then if we use a slash, we'll see that VS Code will start to fill out sort of the next file that you might want to select. And in this case, I'm going to select components, and then I'm going to select info card. So 2 dots will bring us up one directory. We're starting in the source directory. We're going one up into just our main project called club2, and then we're going to go into the components folder, and we're going to grab our info card. The next thing that we're going to want to do is right now we know that our info card replaces our Eiffel Tower. So if we head into our JSX that we're returning, we can actually open up a new sort of HTML element, and we can call it info card. Exactly how we called it in the previous file, right? Remember that this function is called info card. We can add a little slash to say that we don't want to put anything within it, because later on you might want to actually put stuff within your made components, but for now let's just ignore that and let's use a slash to say that we don't want anything within it. Kind of like how the image tag doesn't have any actual components within it, that's what we're saying for this one. And so if we save this file and if we head over to our website, it will say, hey, you attempted to import something which you couldn't find, and so I think I may have put the components folder in the wrong spot, sorry. So if we put the components within source, wow, that was very loud. And if we change our sort of import statement, sorry about that, to be ./components, we'll look right in this directory, grab the components folder, grab our info card, and now if we save, hopefully, we will get an info card. And it turns out it's yelling at us one more time because we didn't say what we actually want to import from this file. So first we'll say, hey, I want to import the info card. And then we'll say, hey, where do we want to import it from? Well, we want to import it from this file. And now if I save, hopefully, finally, after solving a few errors, I'll get my Eiffel Tower info card to show up on my site. And now I have 2 of them. But for now, look how we've defined some part of our website in another file even. We've imported it into our app.js file, and we're displaying it right on our site. For now, you may say, hey, that's not very useful. I still have to write a new one of these for every single location that I want to add to my site. And I would agree with you, and that's where sort of this props value is going to come in. So if we were to, for example, go back to where we called InfoCard, we can start to add these attributes, just like we added with HTML, directly to our pre-made components. Maybe I wanted to say, hey, the location is Eiffel Tower. And maybe I even want to say, hey, maybe the coordinates are as follows. And maybe even the image, right? We'll give it the image link. And for now, if we actually sort of save this file, we'll notice that nothing really happens on our site. We're not using these values in any way. If we head back to InfoCard, we're not using these props. But first, I want to show you what the props actually look like. So before my return statement, if I were to say, hey, console.log props, we can actually show you what these props look like. So if I then sort of reload my page, if I open up my inspect in order to get to my console window here, you'll see, hey, look, these props are an object, and it turns out within our object, we'll see that we have coordinates, an image, and a location, which turns out that's exactly what we defined in this previous app file. We said, hey, you have a location of Eiffel Tower, you have coordinates of 48, etc., and you have an image, which is this link. So look, we can actually grab these individual values within our props. And it turns out that this is called a JSON sort of type. It's just like a dictionary. But for now, just know that we can get at these values within our info card now, right? We printed this in our info card. If we go now into sort of the HTML that we're returning, we can start to replace some of the values that we used previously. For example, this image link, well now we can replace it with props.image. And notice how I added curly braces around that value, and that's because if we want to write some actual JavaScript, we have to use curly braces in our return statements, right? So now, if I save this, you'll notice that nothing actually changes, and that's because it's pulling the same image that we pulled from the previous one. But if I were to maybe update this with the image from the Empire State Building, if I were to change my info card to have that image and save, we would notice that it would update to that Empire State Building image, meaning that we have a component that will actually change based off the information that the programmer gives us. And so we can continue to do that. We can continue to update, right? We'll grab our sort of location name, and we'll change this to props.location. And we'll grab our coordinates, and we'll, for example, change those for now to props.coordinates. Right, if we then save, and if we go back and we refresh, we'll notice, hey, we have our Eiffel Tower here. And it looks like we can actually continue to replace all of these other versions of these locations with this component that we created, right? We can say, hey, I want to create an info card. I want it to have the location of Empire State Building. Right, I want it to have an image, and I want that image to be the exact same one that we've provided here, so I'll just copy and paste it, and I want it to have coordinates, and the coordinates that I provide are going to be right here, and of course I can then save this. Remember to add my slash, so that because we don't want anything within it, and if we then save this, we'll see that we get an Empire State Building here. If I delete sort of the original, you'll notice that we have sort of these components which we're able to give information to and display something on our site. One final note is that we, so far, have only used sort of strings as the prop that we're passing to our function. And it turns out that we could, for example, use numbers as well. So we could maybe say, hey, the longitude is equal to 48.8584, and it turns out that it's going to yell at us a little bit unless we actually surround this in sort of curly braces in order to tell JavaScript that we're trying to type a number in here. And so we can also do this with latitude, which I totally know how to spell, and we can then put in maybe 2.2945, right? And so instead of making the user actually create this string of coordinates, we could start to create it ourselves, right? If we save this file, the first thing that we'll notice when we go into our console is we now have these two new values, right? We have latitude and we have longitude. And if we head back over to our info card, instead of just making the paragraph sort of the coordinates, we could sort of think about grabbing sort of the makeup of the coordinates, which I'll just copy and paste here, and we could say, hey, I only want you to give me the 2 numbers, and we'll deal with the rest of the formatting, right? So here's what the coordinates look like originally. I can then just replace the first number with props.longitude, and I can replace the second number here, once again, using these curly braces to say that I want to actually use JavaScript. I can then say props.latitude, and hopefully, if I've spelled these both correctly, I can save the file. And it turns out that on the one where we actually provided a longitude and latitude, the numbers will update. And it looks like I just misspelled this here, so if I copy that in and paste it, you'll see that we actually have the longitude and latitude displaying there. We'd of course have to go back to our second info card here, get rid of this coordinates value that we were using before, and of course we could add in longitude, and we could set that equal to a number, and we could add latitude, and we could set that equal to a number, and we could once again check in our site, and you'll notice that it will update. So it turns out we can pass pretty much anything using these props values into our components for later. And if we check sort of the final version of our site for this week, which of course you can find on our GitHub page, if we get that running, you'll see that we've just used these components in order to build out a bunch of different versions of this location. And so at the end of the day, if I want you to take one thing away from React, it's the ability to be able to reuse your code that you've written one time, multiple different times on your website, or even give your components to other developers for them to be able to use it on their websites. From here, we'll switch into a social. You can enter into the contest raffle right on the Discord server. I have a Kahoot to play for you, and thank you all for coming. Hopefully I'll see you next week.